Margaret Williams had always been a devoted wife. For 20 years, she and Daniel had built a life together filled with love, laughter, and unwavering commitment. Their marriage was the kind others admired, a partnership rooted in trust and mutual respect. They had 2 children, a beautiful home in the suburbs, and a bond that had seemingly only strengthened with time. Margaret adored Daniel. He was her best friend, her confidant, the only man she had ever truly loved. But love, as Margaret would come to learn, does not always act as an impenetrable shield against temptation. It began subtly, like a whisper in the wind, so quiet that she barely acknowledged it. His name was Alexander Grant. He was a colleague, a charming and ambitious man 10 years her junior, with a smile that could weaken even the strongest of resolves. At first, their interactions were purely professional. Margaret, a senior marketing director at her firm, had taken him under her wing. He was sharp, eager to learn, and his enthusiasm reminded her of a younger version of herself. The first time she truly noticed him was at a company gala. She had been sipping her wine when she felt his gaze upon her. It wasn't inappropriate, but it lingered long enough to make her skin tingle. She brushed it off, convincing herself that she had imagined the intensity behind his eyes. But that night, as she lay in bed next to Daniel, she found herself thinking about Alexander's smile. Months passed, and their interactions grew more personal. A shared joke here, a lingering glance there. Alexander had a way of making her feel seen, reminding her of the woman she used to be before life became a whirlwind of responsibilities. Margaret didn't feel neglected by Daniel, far from it. But there was a thrill in Alexander's presence, a dangerous excitement she hadn't felt in years. Then, one evening, it happened. It was a business trip to Chicago, an overnight stay for a high-profile client meeting. She had been careful, reminding herself that she was a happily married woman, that she loved her husband more than words could express. But temptation is a slow poison, and by the time she realized how deeply she had fallen into its grip, it was too late. They were at the hotel bar, the drinks flowing a little too freely. The conversation was easy, charged with an unspoken tension. Margaret told herself she could control it. But when Alexander reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, she felt a jolt of electricity so intense that it took her breath away. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice low and inviting, "tell me to stop." But she didn't. The guilt was instantaneous, even as he led her to his hotel room, even as their lips met in a desperate, hungry kiss. With every touch, every whispered name, a part of her screamed to stop, to run, and yet she stayed. That night, she betrayed the man who had given her nothing but love for 2 decades. Morning brought no solace. Margaret awoke with a pounding heart and an overwhelming sense of regret. Alexander was still asleep beside her, his arm draped across her waist. She slipped out of bed, dressed hurriedly, and left without a word. The weight of her actions was unbearable. The moment she stepped into their home that evening, Daniel greeted her with a warm kiss, asking about her trip. She smiled, forcing herself to act normal, but inside she was breaking. Days turned into weeks, and the guilt consumed her. She became distant, avoiding Daniel's touch, retreating into herself. She couldn't bear to look into his kind, trusting eyes, knowing what she had done. The affair had lasted only one night, but the betrayal was eternal. One evening, Daniel confronted her. "Maggie, what's wrong? You've been different." Tears welled in her eyes. The weight of her secret had become unbearable. She wanted to lie, to protect him from the pain, but she owed him the truth. "I made a mistake," she whispered, her voice shaking. "A terrible, unforgivable mistake." Daniel's expression changed in an instant. Confusion, then realization, then heartbreak. He stepped back as if her words had physically struck him. "Tell me you didn't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did," she admitted, sobbing. "I don't know why. I don't have an excuse. I love you, Daniel. I love you so much." Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Finally, Daniel took a deep breath. "I need time." And with that, he walked away, leaving Margaret standing alone, drowning in her regret. The happily ever after she had built had shattered in an instant, and she knew, no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The divorce was civil but excruciating. Their children were heartbroken, struggling to understand why their perfect family had fallen apart. Margaret moved into a smaller apartment, while Daniel kept the house. He eventually found someone new, someone he could trust. Margaret, however, found that no amount of time could erase the regret. The betrayal had cost her everything, and she would carry its weight for the rest of her life. Her relationship with her children became strained. They were old enough to understand that something had gone terribly wrong, but too young to comprehend the complexities of love, trust, and betrayal. At first, they resented her, blaming her for the broken home. She tried to be present, attending school events, making time for them, but the bond had weakened. Daniel remained the stable figure in their lives, while Margaret was the source of pain they struggled to forgive. Daniel, on the other hand, had rebuilt his life with quiet dignity. He met a woman named Emily, a kind, understanding woman who helped him heal. They took things slowly, but in time, she became a part of his life, and eventually, the children's lives too. Daniel never spoke ill of Margaret, but his actions made it clear he had moved on. Margaret, though still a mother, often felt like an outsider in her own children's lives. She spent holidays alone, only receiving brief visits. She had made a mistake that had cost her more than she could have imagined, and no matter how much she tried to make amends, some wounds never fully healed. Years passed, and Margaret found herself growing old alone. She had tried dating, but nothing ever felt right. Regret became her lifelong companion, a shadow that never left her side. She dedicated herself to charity work, hoping to find redemption in service. She mentored young women in her field, hoping to guide them away from making the same mistakes she had. Her children eventually had families of their own. They invited her to see her grandchildren, but the visits were brief, polite, lacking the warmth she longed for. Daniel, now happily remarried, seemed content, at peace. Margaret, however, had never fully found that peace. One evening, sitting alone in her small apartment, she looked at an old photo of her family, the four of them, smiling, untouched by the pain that would come. Tears slipped down her face as she whispered into the silence, "I'm sorry." But there was no one left to hear it.